Shabbat Shalom, dear friends. Shabbat Shalom. Nice to be back together with you. This week we are reading Parashat Vayikra. And it's gotten cold and we're getting ready for Pesach. When I was 8 or 9 years old, one of the treats, we lived in Queens, New York, is my mother on school vacations would take my older brother and I to the American Museum of Natural History. You all know that museum. That's the one with all the dinosaurs in it. And I lived in Queens, and from there, it was a bus ride and 2 trains, and it took an hour and a half. Now, you might think that that journey was difficult, but that was actually the joy. It was a joy to be on the subway. I loved riding in the first car and watching the train go through the dark tunnels. And I loved the museum. My brother, who was also into it, we had a great time together. One vacation, we made it to the museum. We had a wonderful time. And then we got on the train to go back home. And on the train, in the middle of the ride, the train came to a complete stop and all the lights went out. There were no emergency lights on. It was complete darkness. And I reached out to my mother and I grabbed her hand and she leaned over to me and she said, "It's just like Egypt. It's just like the plague of darkness." So we've been in COVID, we've been in this pandemic for just about a year. It's our second Pesach. And I'm asking myself, of the 10 plagues that we have in the Haggadah, which one most closely relates to our own experience during the pandemic? And for me, at least right now, the most analogous plague is the one of darkness. In the Torah text itself, when it talks about the plague of darkness, it says, Vayimesh choshech, and the darkness was thick. It was darkness that you could touch. It was darkness that you could feel. So it's interesting. What does exactly that mean? It meant that what was going on was not just an absence of light, but that they couldn't see each other because it was a palpable darkness. They could feel the darkness. The gloom was tangible. It brings to mind that expression, that's tension that is so thick that you could cut it with a knife. Tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. So that, it seems to me, back in the day of the ancient Israelites, what was it about this plague that was difficult? Is that they couldn't see each other. Seems to me that today, during our pandemic, during this past year, there have been many difficulties. Everything has been harder. Everything has been more complicated. The world has been turned upside down. But perhaps the greatest pain has been the fact that we have not been able to see our loved ones, our children, our siblings, our grandchildren. For a variety of different times during this pandemic, we just couldn't see them. It was like we were moving through darkness, darkness that could be touched, darkness that could be felt. In our Torah, when it continues to talk about the plague of darkness, it says about the ancient Israelites, V'chol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvotam. But in the homes of the Israelites, in each of their homes, there was a light. So it wasn't something that had to do with geography. It wasn't something that God gave them light, but there was light in their homes. This led several of our commentators to point out, what kind of light was it? Where was that light? And so some of them say the following, that this light, the light that overwhelmed the darkness, wasn't geographic and it wasn't a miracle. It was light in the spirit of the ancient Israelites. They generated their own internal energy. they generated their own internal light. How did our ancient ancestors survive in Egypt? They survived because they had an inner light when the whole world was dark. It wasn't coming together as a community. It wasn't how they built their homes. It wasn't that they were able to somehow light their own matches. They generated their own internal light system. I hope that this pandemic will be coming to an end. Perhaps we could say there's light at the end of the tunnel, but it's still difficult. I hope that we're able to generate our own internal energy, our own internal resistance, that we can see everybody and see each other. Let me tell you about a man by the name of John, who's a registered electrician in Malta. When it came to his retirement, someone asked, "How did you become an electrician? How did you get interested in all of this?" And he said, "When I was a young man, my home had no electricity. I would study at night by reading from a kerosene lamp. And then electricity came to Malta. But it didn't come to my neighborhood. It didn't come to my poor neighborhood. And even though we would call the utility, nobody came. I was frustrated. I went to the hardware store and I bought equipment. I bought the equipment and I put together the wiring in my own home. I was a teenager. I thought I could figure it out. But then came that critical moment when the utility came to put in the meter. Would it work? Would they say it was okay? The man who looked at my work, looked at the wiring, and he said, "Bravo, you did a great job. It's wonderful, and it will work." I then went and wired the rest of my home. I then went and began to read more and more about electricity. I went to school, I got my license, and I began to do wiring and add light to all of the homes in my area of Malta. And then John concluded and said, there was a spark. There was darkness all over Malta. There was darkness in my life. But I had this inner energy to overcome that moment of difficulty. And when I helped myself, I was able to help all of my friends and neighbors as well. My dear friends, as we gather together at the Seder table, and maybe our family and friends are there, and maybe they are not. Maybe we will be able to see them, and maybe we cannot. But know that this darkness will end soon, and it will end because each one of us has the strength and the possibility of adding our own personal inner light to the world. Shabbat Shalom and a Zis in Pesach.